Hello, my name's Evan Abramson. I'm a landscape planner and designer at Landscape Interactions, and I'm going to be presenting today with my colleague and collaborator Jason Steiding from the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe. We've worked together on a project the past couple years in Cape Cod. So the first part of the presentation will be essentially my presentation about our process for converting landscapes large and small to biodiverse pollinator supporting habitat. And then we'll hear from Jason regarding his work as the Natural Resources Director for the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe. So I'd like to start off by just kind of painting a little bit of a picture of where we live, the times that we live in today, and why this work to restore native habitat is so important. We are living in a new geological epoch. It's called the age of the Anthropocene. Essentially, humans have altered the Earth's living systems to a very large extent. And in the future, when archaeologists are digging through the Earth's soil, they will find traces of our civilization through things like elevated carbon emissions, elevated levels of plastic and pollutants, sea level rise, as well as the global mass extinction of species. And currently, between 30 and 50% of all species on the planet are heading toward extinction by the middle of this century. It's essentially a collapse of nature that we are facing. There's about 1 million species threatened with extinction globally, including nearly 25% of the native bee species in North America. Insects are essential for all ecosystems, not just as pollinators, but also as food for other creatures and recyclers of nutrients. The main reason for the insect collapse is loss of habitat. So essentially, when humans change the Earth's landscape, whether it's through urban and suburban sprawl, large-scale agriculture, logging, what have you, that is really what we would consider to be a loss of habitat. We are taking pieces of land that are natural and we are making them developed. So in the words of one scientist, we're sleepwalking towards the edge of a cliff. Not just insects are being impacted by the loss of habitat. North America has lost 1 in 4 birds in the past 50 years for the same major factor, its loss of habitat. According to the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity, the 5 main threats to global biodiversity are listed here, and the first 2 threats, which are the 2 biggest, together equate loss of habitat. So a lot of the work that you all are doing, whether you work for conservation organizations or other allied work, hopefully you are already aware of this problem, but I want to highlight it because it is directly contributing to global biodiversity loss, and with pollinators in particular. Now, regarding the climate crisis, a lot of people are very focused on carbon emissions right now, understandably so, but in order to really address the climate crisis, we actually depend upon diverse ecosystems, because diverse ecosystems help stabilize the climate and have a better chance at surviving in a world that's being altered by rising emissions. To give the example, if you're in the middle of a city or a town center on a summer's day, perhaps you get into your car at 3 or 4 p.m. and the dashboard says that it's 103 degrees. If you drive out of town into a forested area in western Massachusetts or anywhere around here, you will quite possibly be within just 5 to 10 minutes in a place where it's 10 or even 15 degrees cooler. The reason for that is because that forested system is mitigating the effect of that urban heat island effect. It's mitigating that climate change impact of rising heat. And we really depend upon our ecosystems for that. So rather than looking at biodiversity loss as a result of climate change or a victim of climate change, we should really consider biodiversity as an ally in responding to the climate crisis. So that means restoring, replanting, and recreating very diverse plant communities that support diverse animal communities. In a climate change scenario, the risk of wildfire is much more elevated now than it ever was before. And we're seeing wildfires in places in the Northeast where they were really not imaginable even 5 or 10 years ago. The difference between a forested system and an open field, you could call it a meadow or a grassland system, in responding to fire is very significant. When a fire moves through a forested system, the carbon is immediately released into the atmosphere, and that carbon is no longer going to be sequestered until those trees reestablish, which could take decades upon decades. Whereas in a grassland or a meadow ecosystem, if you want to call it that, those plants actually are mostly fire adapted, and when they burn, the carbon is stored in their roots, so the carbon is not released, so it's not a carbon loss, and they actually benefit from occasional wildfire. This diagram, some of you may be familiar with. It's just showing the root systems of different native grassland species. So on the left, we have Kentucky bluegrass. That's your typical lawn grass. It's non-native to New England. Its roots are about 3 inches deep. This is heath aster, Symphyotrichum ericoides. Its roots are about maybe 8 to 9 feet deep. This is switchgrass, and this is little blue stem. So those root systems are very much alive and very much thriving despite a wildfire. This is some video that was taken last fall. Wildfires broke out in Lynn, Massachusetts, and in the Berkshires, as well as New Jersey, Manhattan, and Brooklyn. And I'm highlighting this because these are forests that are becoming increasingly messified. They're becoming dominated by non-fire adapted trees, species like birch, beech, and maple, and species like oak and hickory are being replaced. That is sort of the trend in our part of the world. So what happens when those forested systems burn is that not many plant species survive because of that messification. And messification is actually resulting in a lowering of the plant diversity in our forested landscapes in New England because we don't have regular disturbance through wildfire, contrary to what occurred historically through indigenous land management. So our sort of thesis here is that in this time of the Anthropocene with widespread or wild-scale species declines, we're facing the global mass extinction of species, not just animal but plant. It's really our responsibility to restore these diverse systems by recreating nature in this age of the Anthropocene. And we do that at where I work, we do that by looking at which pollinator species are declining in a given area and then which plants they need. What are their pollen, nectar, and host plants? And by identifying that for species that are at risk, we are able to create a much more diverse landscape that is then going to support a wider diversity of wildlife species. Because what happens, here at the bottom affects the entire food web. Pollinators and other insects are fertilizing plants, producing seeds and fruit. That's feeding the entire food web, including humans. So why are pollinators significant? Well, they're primarily insects that fertilize plants, producing seeds and fruit. About 80% of the world's flowering plants depend upon pollinators. In Massachusetts, nearly half of our food crops depend upon bees specifically, and 1/3 of the global food supply needs some sort of animal, including insect pollinator. Most habitats and ecosystems are dependent upon pollinators, whether through the fertilization of plants or the creating of nest sites. Some plants are very highly specialized in their relationship with pollinators. That's known as a pollen specialist or a host plant specialist. And about 15% of the native bee species in the Northeast only gather pollen from a very small subset of plants. So I like to look at a landscape through the eyes of a native bee to understand how we can create this diverse system, because bees are a very good proxy for the wider sort of spectrum of pollinators. So there's about 4,000 native bee species in the US, and over 400 of them are found in the Northeast. There was recently an atlas of all the bees in Massachusetts published, and I think they found 380 something. So we're pretty diverse, nearly 10% of the national bee species diversity is found in Massachusetts. The vast majority of our food crops depend upon wild bees and other insects for pollination, not honeybees. They did a global study of 41 different food crops, including everything from tomatoes and eggplant to watermelon, cotton, and coffee. And they found in every single case that wild pollinators were twice as effective as honeybees in producing seeds and fruit. The average range that a native bee in the Northeast flies from its nest site is only between 200 and 1,800 feet. That's the average, not the maximum, but that's sort of our proxy for if we're trying to create, let's say, a corridor or a pathway. We want to be looking at having pieces of habitat or gardens, or whatever you want to call them, within somewhere around 1,000 feet of each other. 70% of the native bee species that are found in the Northeast nest underground. Most are solitary. They're just a female queen laying eggs and rearing them until they're adults and they can fly out on their own. They're not colonies like a honeybee. Examples of habitat include bare exposed ground in well-draining soil. So basically dry soil in the sun, soft twigs, hollow twigs on plants like raspberries or Joe Pyeweed are good examples. Abandoned rodent burrows are another great opportunity for nesting, especially bumblebees. Dead trees, and even dead snags and dead branches. These are all habitat opportunities for our pollinators. This diagram is looking at a 200-acre site in the Hudson Valley in New York, and it's giving you a sense of scale. So across a 200-acre site, with these 4 habitat parcels within that, we have a meadow at the top in the center of the fields. We have hedgerows and meadow in the middle near the house, a pond restoration a little bit south of that, and then another meadow in the lower field. You can see that bumblebees, which are represented by the yellow line, would be able to travel across the entire 200-acre site with just those 4 small pieces of habitat. Mason bees, the blue line, pretty much the same. Whereas sweat bees, which are one of our smaller native bee species, they would not necessarily move from place to place on that landscape. But, not everyone can be perfect. There's many other significant pollinators that we look at and consider when designing projects. The ruby-throated hummingbird is probably a, let's call it a flagship species we're all familiar with. They're not threatened, so we're not particularly targeting them in our restoration work, but they do benefit from the restoration work in that they pollinate tubular flowers, which is also a type of flower that would be visited by long-tongued bumblebees, which tend to be at risk. So they're sort of like a generalist for tubular flowers. The Aphrodite fritillary butterfly, they are a species of conservation concern in Massachusetts. They're also at risk in New York State. They only lay their eggs on native violets, so that's an example of a host plant specialist. If you don't have native violets, you won't have Aphrodite fritillaries. The monarch butterfly, I think we all know, its milkweed is the host plant. Something that's important to consider is that 2 recent papers found that east of the Mississippi, monarchs are actually not declining. They're more abundant than they were when surveys began over 2 decades ago. I think a lot of that has to do with the high focus that we have on, saving the monarchs. So I want you all just to consider that there's also 44 butterflies and moths of conservation concern in Massachusetts besides the monarch. And those are the kinds of species that we might be targeting on our projects. The southern pine sphinx moth is a host plant specialist. They lay their eggs on native pine, specifically pitch pine. That's their preferred host. They're also important because they pollinate at night. So they're kind of filling in a gap that a lot of the daytime pollinators like bees are not able to fill. They're at risk in New York and critically imperiled or vulnerable in many other states, even as far west as Indiana. And I want to preface this by saying that most states are not very up to speed with which species are actually of concern or declining. We know very little about those sorts of things. We're sort of in a moment where there's more efforts being put into figuring out where different pollinators are found, but we have very little data to go off of. So we do our best to try to determine that. With regard to honeybees, I think a lot of people became aware of the let's call it the pollinator cause or the pollinator issue, because of colony collapse disorder. We lost half of the honeybee hives in the US between 1980 and 2005. The main threats affecting honeybees are not that different from what's affecting native bees. However, since 2005, the number of honeybee colonies have actually not only increased but stabilized. So what this tells us is that honeybees are not in decline. They're not at risk. They're not at risk of extinction. We don't need to save honeybees. They are basically a livestock. This map is showing you overall abundance of wild bees in the US over a 5-year period between 2010 and 2015. The areas in yellow are the areas with the lowest wild bee abundance in that very short period. So in that short period of 5 years, we lost nearly a quarter of our total numbers of wild bees. This map is showing you estimated agricultural use of one type of neonicotinoid pesticide. So you can see here that these two maps are, for lack of a better term, nearly identical. The areas that have the highest neonicotinoid use are the areas that have the lowest wild bee abundance. This is a list of peer-reviewed papers that look at honeybee competition with wild bees and other wild insects. And here's a few interesting quotes from them. Essentially, what the literature tells us overwhelmingly is that raising honeybees to save the bees is like raising chickens to save the birds. It just doesn't really make sense. So what I'm trying to hone in here is the difference between diversity and abundance. To give the example of Massachusetts, we've got about 11 bumblebee species that were historically found in relatively even numbers throughout the state. 2 of them were found, but they were like very, very rare. So of those 11 species of bumblebee historically present in Massachusetts, 2 of them are locally extinct, or what's known as extirpated. They're gone from the state, and that's Bombus affinis and Bombus pennsylvanicus. No one has found them for, I think, over 15 years, maybe more. We're facing potentially the loss of 2 more bumblebee species within the next decade, unless something significant happens, and that's Bombus vagans and Bombus fervidus. In New York, 25% of bumblebee species are already locally extinct, and the recent Empire State Native Pollinator Survey found that between 38 and 60% of all the different bees, flies, beetles, and moths that were surveyed are either extirpated or at risk of extirpation. So that's nearly half. So lots of bees is not always a good thing. This map is of the Hudson River Estuary watershed. That's the entire land area that drains into the lower half of the Hudson River. At the northern extent, you have Troy, New York, just north of Albany. And at the bottom, you have Battery Park in Manhattan, parts of western Brooklyn, and even a little bit of Queens. In this entire land area, which includes millions of people and thousands of towns and cities, between 2000 and 2021, 62% of all bumblebee species observations were one species. And that's Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee. This is from data taken off of iNaturalist, coordinated scientific surveys that were executed by the New York Natural Heritage Program as part of the Empire State Native Pollinator Survey, as well as local research efforts on the part of various different scientists and organizations. So this bar graph, what it's showing us is the bars that are in turquoise are historic observations of bumblebees within that exact land area, the Hudson River Estuary watershed. Between 1877 and 1999, you had, I think, 18 different species observed. And then the yellow is in the last 22 years. So you can see that it's very much out of whack, and it's very much a loss of diversity. It's really just a handful of species now. We're also facing widespread loss of native plants. It's no coincidence that at the same time, 25% of New York and New England's native plant species have been lost in comparison with historical figures, and non-native plant species have increased regionally by 20%. UMass Amherst published a paper last year. They found that non-native plants and animals, including invasive species, spread 100 times faster than native species. Just a little highlight the difference between a native plant and a cultivar of a native plant. So a cultivar of a native plant is called a nativar. Essentially, it's been horticulturally modified to have a certain characteristic, let's say more showy flowers, a longer bloom time, resistance to perhaps some sort of mold. But the literature tells us that overwhelmingly insects, and especially pollinators, prefer to forage from native plants compared to cultivars of native plants. So it's very important, if you're working for a land conservation organization or a land trust or a conservation commission, or if you're a private landowner, select native plants, not cultivars of native plants. And you can distinguish that simply by looking at the name. If it has two names in Latin, a genus followed by a species, it's going to be native. If it has a third or fourth name added onto it in English, usually it's in single quotations, that is a cultivar. So to give the example, you have Monarda didyma. You have Monarda didyma, I think it's called Jacob's Klein. So Jacob's Klein is English, Monarda didyma is Latin, so it's a cultivar of the native, not the same thing. The differences really matter. The recently published Somerville Pollinator Action Plan is a really great project. However, even at the level of having so much community input, a scientific researcher whom I really respect working on it, they published 755 recommended plants for native pollinators in Somerville. Of those, nearly 20% are either non-native or cultivars, and some were even exotic to the entire United States. Most pollinator conservation efforts are really biased towards increasing abundance of species rather than the diversity of species. That can be seen if you look at the plant list for organizations like the Xerces Society or Pollinator Partnership. They're really not focusing on species in decline. We have bee hotels that you can purchase online. This is taken from Amazon. Those are actually detrimental to cavity nesting bees if they're not cleaned thoroughly every year, because pathogens remain in the tubes. But most of them are not able to be disassembled to be thoroughly cleaned. So you could be doing more harm than good. Cheerios gave out wildflower seed mixes in an effort to save the bees, and the seed mix contained exotic species to the United States. Birds also depend upon native plants. It's not just an insect thing. I think a lot of you probably are aware of that. To cite one paper that was done by Desiree Naranjo and Doug Talamy, they looked at suburban yards in the DC area, and if they did not have at least 70% native plants in terms of overall biomass on the site, it could not sustain a single nest of Carolina chickadees because there weren't enough caterpillars on the property. So that's sort of the background. I'll show you guys a few case studies from some of our projects, and then I'll pass the stage over to Jason. So Habit to Habitat is a project that we did a couple of years ago in Wellesley, Massachusetts. Essentially, we converted a 2-acre lawn outside the library into a diverse landscape. So this is what it looked like in 2022. The site was surveyed 3 times before we did any changes. That's what we call our baseline data collection. And we try to gather that information as much as possible to compare how our projects are affecting species over time. Are they actually making a difference? So we compare before and after. In the case of Wellesley, there were 3 surveys that were conducted, 2 in 2022 in August, 1 in May of 2023. Not a single bee or butterfly was found anywhere on the site. We did a literature review, consulting with a number of scientific experts, and we determined that this list of species were species that are either historically present in the Wellesley area but no longer found, or are found at lower numbers now than were historically found. So they're either declining or at risk of extirpation. So it's 45 bee species, 31 butterfly species. This is just a few examples of those species. The eastern willow miner bee only gathers pollen from native willow. So that's a great opportunity to support a lot of different bee species. The blueberry cellophane bee only gathers pollen from Ericaceae, which are basically blueberries, cranberries, and bearberries. The common loosestrife oil bee only gathers pollen as well as floral oils from native loosestrife, not the invasive purple loosestrife. You can tell the difference because the native ones are yellow. The frosted elfin is a butterfly of concern. It's actually, I think it might be on the endangered species list. It's definitely of concern in Massachusetts. They only lay their eggs on lupin or Baptisia tinctoria. The juniper hairstreak needs eastern red cedar to lay its eggs, so it's also a specialist. And the crossline skipper only lays its eggs on native warm season grasses such as little blue stem and purple top. So our design for the site included a series of circular spaces. We had a shade meadow leading to a full sun meadow. There's a curved path. There's a bee and butterfly lawn replacement, a gathering space, some woodland edge plantings, and sort of like this flowering grassland area. So just taking you through the process a little bit. Remember, it was all grass. This is our sort of concept design of what the site will look like when it's fully established. We did a bloom chart just showing the different plants across the growing season on the site. So just to ensure that we have, you basically, for pollinators, you want to have something always in bloom. You want to have something always producing pollen, nectar, seeds, whatever. Even in the winter, leaf standing stems. You know, these are all opportunities for nesting, for laying eggs, for eating. So to get where we want it to be, we had to get rid of the grass. This area was in the wetland buffer. We couldn't use herbicides. It's also outside the library, so that wasn't really an opportunity. So we decided to tarp the site using black silage tarp. Huge rolls of black plastic that are reusable, and in fact, we reused them. I think we reused them in Mashpee the next year. But anyway, to do this, we were concerned that people would complain. So this is right outside the library. There was a lot of plastic. You've got to leave the plastic down for basically the entire growing season to kill off the grass. So we created stencils, on cardboard and then spray painted them. And miraculously, no one complained. 5 months later, we pulled off the plastic. A lot of the grass was dead. I won't say all of it, but most of it. We did a little bit of manual removal, and then we planted. And the entire site was installed over the course of 2 weekends with all volunteer help and the DPW helping with moving the large benches, the granite benches. This is what the site looked like on May 1st of the first growing season. Basically what you're seeing is on the right, the cover crop for the meadow. That's winter wheat. That's just like a nurse crop. And on the left, you're seeing the service berries in bloom with a little bit of sedges on the left side. This is what it looked like in mid-June. You can see a large difference already was taking place within just about 5 or 6 weeks. We had native roses in bloom, penstemon, prunella vulgaris, blephila. Then this is what the site looked like towards the end of August. So this is all within less than 1 year of planting. And already there were bees on the site within just a few months. Some of the thistles had up to 4 or 5 bees on a single flower. This project from Egremont, which is all the way in the western part of the state near Great Barrington, is another case study for where we have some of our first data showing the differences. In Wellesley, we will continue to survey as we're going into our second season. Again, in Egremont, basically it was a public park, a grass to habitat conversion, all with volunteers. This is what it looked like less than 3 years after installation. So pretty well established by the third growing season. We did a citizen science workshop on the site in July of 2023, where we taught people how to use their smartphones to identify bumblebees. And within 1 hour, we had identified 7 bumblebee species on the site. That's compared to 2 bumblebee species that were there in 2020 before we did any grass removal. The 2 bumblebee species in 2020 were both common species. Of the 7 observed in 23, 2 are species at risk. One of them is listed by Mass Wildlife as possibly extirpated from the state. And so that just took less than 3 seasons to show that difference. And we endeavor to continue surveying and hopefully capture more data on butterflies and other bees. I feel like my time is sort of coming to an end, so I'm just going to skip through here. This is a regional plan that we did in New York. It's a cool project, but I don't think I have time to really go into it. But I'll give you guys a link where you can see this on our website. And just some pictures of installation in New York. We use, oftentimes use no-till wildflower seed drills on large-scale meadow installations. Those are much more productive, let's say, than just broadcasting on a large site. That basically is putting those seeds in at a depth that is adequate for the native seeds. We did a riparian restoration, urban, and Just want to get here to, okay, so this project is kind of different. On this project in Western Mass, we have been looking at the impacts of prescribed fire and rotational grazing on grassland regeneration. So the site was burned in 2021, and it was immediately grazed by 6 sheep and a guard llama. Within the first growing season, we had much higher plant diversity and following the burn, and there were over 40 native plant species that at the end of the season, even though they were being grazed repeatedly, they were able to bloom, produce flowers and seeds. And that's because the livestock were being moved to a new section of the field every week and being moved to a new subsection within each section every 2 or 3 days. Then after the burning and the second year of grazing, the site was basically mowed down as low as possible, raked, and broadcast seeded with a couple of different seed mixes. And in this case, we just broadcast them by hand. We didn't use a drill. During the first growing season, that's basically your initial site establishment year. So you're mowing the meadow once a month to kind of keep everything down to let the seeds germinate. And you can see on the right that there's quite a number of native plant species in that picture. I might call out Tom to identify what's some of the plants on the right.
Looks like lupins, Camacristas in there, right? Something like that. Can't tell really anything else.
Do you see butterfly weed maybe? Definitely some, I think there's a penstemons in there. That's definitely possible. We don't want that. But anyway, so that's the first growing season. Then we have the second growing season where you're basically able to release the meadow from the mowing and let it establish. So you get obviously, that first flush, including the black-eyed Susan. There was a wet meadow. There were lobelias, some monarda. Then this third growing season, so you can see the meadows changing over time. We were supposed to do another burn through the NRCS, but with the current federal funding hold, we're probably not going to be doing it this year. But the lupins came in pretty strong by the third season and the butterfly weed. And notably, we observed Bombus fervidus on the site in last season, which again is one of our target species. It's imperiled in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, and Maine, vulnerable in several other states. And I quote Mass Wildlife, may be extirpated from Massachusetts. Obviously not. We've found it on 2 of our sites in Western Mass in the last 2 years. So this is our project with the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe. It's called Biodiversity in the First Light. It's essentially a project to create more diverse habitat on 2 stormwater basins that are located behind their tribal community center and council building in Mashpee. So this is what the basins looked like when the project started. It was a mix of native and non-native species. There was quite a lot of mugwort. And so we decided collectively to basically start fresh and create brand new plant communities there. This site is located just adjacent to a large pitch pine scrub oak community, which is a rare plant community in Massachusetts. So hoping to pull some of the diversity out of that forested area into the basins and build off of that. It's also within a Category 4 hurricane inundation zone. So that's important to consider as far as the water table. So this is sort of our general design for the site. It was 2 basins that were densely planted around the edges. One was densely planted in the middle as well as the edges. The other, we did a seed mix on the inner basin, but not in the center. Sort of a mix of different approaches. This is about a half-acre site. This is just a sort of rendering of what the basin would look like from either side and in the middle. We used plants that were given to us by Jason and his tribe members that are culturally significant to the tribe for either medicinal or other purposes, perhaps for building materials, for basketry, for other things like that, for food. And what was interesting was that a large number of the plants that were listed by the tribe as culturally significant also were significant to the at-risk pollinator species that we were targeting for the project. Either they were pollen plants, nectar plants, or host plants. So that was really exciting. We don't normally have access to that sort of information. And in this case, we were able to get pretty accurate records for over 80 species, or nearly 90 species, let's say, that are at risk in the Cape Cod area that are benefiting from this project. The process basically looked like large-scale tarping, followed by intensive planting, and then this year we're going into management, where there will be some mowing of the seeded areas and some hand pulling in the planted areas. So this is what it looked like last May. We went out there and put down almost half an acre of black plastic, which is going to be reused by the tribe on their farm for growing vegetables, and some of it we took back that we lent to them to use on some of our other sites. So this is what half an acre of tarp looks like, going up and down the different contours of the basins. When we removed it, it looked like this. It was bare earth. There was a little bit of mugwort residue that was still present, so we did do a little bit of scraping before we planted, just to be sure. And the site was installed, I think, over the course of about 4 days, all through volunteers and a little bit of help from a local landscaping company. So just to close things out, if you go to this link on our website, you can see some of our projects and you can access them, either downloading PDFs or we have some print-on-demand books. And I'll let Jason take it from here. Thanks.
Oh, thanks for the warning. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Steiding. I'm the Natural Resources Director for the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe and also an enrolled member of the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe. This is going to be very difficult for me. I am used to moving all over the place. I apologize. I will try and sit still. Very, very difficult. After seeing some of those after pictures, I cannot wait to see what our project looks like. And I will get into our project in a little bit. I just kind of wanted to talk about some of the things that we have going on in Mashpee as far as conservation efforts are concerned and some of the challenges that we're up against on a daily basis. First, what I wanted to do, and what I usually like to typically do for folks who aren't really in the know, talk a little bit about our historical territory. And this map is relatively accurate, but our territory at one point went as far north as Gloucester, through Boston, what is now the South Shore, South Shore, Cape Cod and the islands, and eastern Rhode Island. It was a vast territory, and we were the original stewards of these lands, right? The original conservationists. Some folks would say we did a pretty good job for a very long time. This is a map of what our territory looks like now. Pulled this off the USGS site. The areas in red are what the Mashpee Wampanoag now control. You can see there's quite a difference. We control what is now 1/10 of 1% of our historical homelands. With Western European colonization, it's determined that native tribes lost 99% of their lands. And then you factor in, of course, Western development with the loss of habitat, biodiversity, as you mentioned plenty of times. This is all accelerated climate change, and so we're in a pretty tough spot. And everyone, I'm not saying that the tribes are the only ones in a difficult situation. We know what it's like out there, but indigenous and minority communities are most adversely affected. But I kind of want to just touch real briefly on Evan's project with us. We met a few years back when the tribe hosted a pesticide conference through EPA, and it took us a while to get going, but Evan came into town and we put that project together last year. I cannot wait to see what it looks like. If anyone is local and you're in Mashpee, I would say please come by this spring. I would love to show it to you. I would love to talk about it, have you see our building. We'll give you a tour, whatever it is. I can't wait to see that project. And again, it was focused on pollinators, right? but like Evan said, it was also quite a bit of culturally significant plants. And Evan was gracious enough to work with us and our chief to identify some of these plants, source some of these plants, which is very, very difficult, and bring these onto our property. So not only is it a pollinator project, but we're going to be able to turn this into an area for elders, anyone who wants to come. There'll be stones set up for benches. It'll be an area for relaxation, meditation. You can perform ceremony there if you'd like. And there'll be educational opportunities as well for anyone who wants to learn more about the actual ecosystem itself, the biodiversity, all of the plants, including the culturally significant plants. So we can teach people what these plants are used for, what they were used for traditionally. Like you said, it could be medicine, it could be food, it could be for our homes. There are so many things that are in this project, so it's really cool, and we're really excited to see what it looks like. Every year, I run a 5-week summer science camp. It's called POH, which stands for Preserving Our Homelands. And you know, we do varying things throughout the years, and we try to mix up the curriculum a little bit so the kids aren't bored, because we have the same kids probably for about 3 or 4 years. But the one thing that we do consistently every year is we have a pollinator day. And this just so happened to be last year's in July on our farm. And it's usually sponsored by U.S. Fish and Wildlife and an organization called the Friends of Mashpee. And again, it is pollinators and culturally significant plants that we teach our kids about what the plants are used for, and again, why they're so important, not only to the ecosystem, but to their culture. It's a long day. We put in thousands and thousands of plants. And again, this was on our farm location just this past summer. We'll be doing it again, and I know that Evan, you and I are talking about hopefully another project that we can do in our housing community. We have a development that was built probably about 5 years ago, and it's really devoid of anything. It was just kind of scraped down, and nothing was replanted. So it's a really nice area, and I'm hoping that we will be able to get in there as well. And again, this was just another part of our POH camp. This is our chief, Earl Mills. And, you know, he's taking the kids through, that's on the right-hand side, that's what we call Santuit Preserve right now. In that area, we worked with the town of Mashpee last year to plant, I think it was probably 300 or 400 white cedar saplings, which again are culturally significant to the tribe. We were walking through the preserve on that day just to show the kids the results of that, and to again explain why those plants are so significant, not only to the region but to the tribe. And then we stumbled upon a patch of witch hazel there, which again was another teaching lesson for the kids. You know, when I show that slide about the land and how little land we have control of, you know, it is very difficult to be a conservationist or a steward of the land if you don't own any land. It's almost impossible. But you know, there are ways to get around it, and one of the ways that we do it is through partnerships, and they're very important to us. And we realize how important Western science is in everything that we do, and we understand how important Western science is right along with traditional ecological knowledge. And one of the things that we tend to forget too, I think sometimes when we talk about land conservation, is I think sometimes we might overlook our rivers and our streams and our ponds. And this was a project that we're working on right now through a Municipal Vulnerability Program grant. I should have just said MVP, with the town of Mashpee and the SNEP network. This is a historical pond for the tribe. I see a tribal member back there right now. The name Santuit itself means place of the sachems. So on the shorelines of this pond, hundreds of years ago, was our meeting house, which was a place for sachems and other spiritual leaders to meet. That church, that meeting house, is now across town, but this pond does hold a lot of significance to us. But the pond is in rough shape, as you'll see from this slide here. When I was a kid, this pond had white, sandy, rocky shores. You could swim in it. You could definitely fish in it, because we fished in it all the time. Now you don't even want to go near the pond. It's really anoxic. It's actually, you can see this pond on GPS, and it's like green. It's really, really bad. There's 8 feet of sediment. The sediment has been proven to be toxic. It's got toxic metals in it. We had looked one year to work with Army Corps of Engineers to try and dredge the pond. We cannot, because that material is toxic. It cannot leave. It cannot be dumped anywhere, delivered anywhere. So it's it's a really, it's a nice project in the sense that the tribe has been receiving technical assistance about non-point source solutions and retrofitting storm drains and that sort of thing. So we have been able to learn a little bit about that side of it, and at the same time, we've been also able to, talk about the history of the tribe and why it is so important to us and to people in Mashpee. So I like that part of the project. And then again, this isn't the only pond that's at risk. There are many other ponds that are at risk. And most importantly, we're going to continue these partnerships moving forward because, again, they are so imperative to us. And I just wanted to show this. This is Santuit Pond. There is a boat landing there that's all dirt right now. It's really, really hard compacted gravel, and it comes down from high up a hill. And most of the water that runs into that pond, or a significant amount of it, flows down there. So we've done we haven't done a rendering, but this is a rendering of what that boat landing will hopefully look like. There'll be a rain garden to accept water. It'll be a pollinator garden as well. And again, we have asked the town and some of the engineers that we work with to include culturally significant plants, which we will. And again, we're going to turn this into an educational opportunity. There'll be signage about the history of the tribe, the project itself, and then we have artists, native Wampanoag artists who will do murals and that sort of thing on some of those concrete benches. So this is going to be a really, really cool project. Really excited to see this happen, and can't wait for that. And then again, I'm going to keep hammering these relationships and these partnerships and just how important they are for us. We've got folks in the community who really are scientists in a different sense of the word and have been doing this type of work and doing this conservation for thousands of years, let's face it. But again, it is so important to us to have technical assistance and partnerships. And I'd like to just go through a few of those right now, really, really quickly. So some of you might even be familiar with some of these. There's a lot of this habitat restoration projects that are going on in a lot of the cranberry bogs on Cape Cod. There's the Coonamessett River restoration, which is going to focus not only on fish passage, but also on invasives removals. And a very similar project across town is another project on Hamlin Bog and Marston's Mills, which is focusing on exactly the same things, but also there's a nitrogen removal aspect to that project as well. And then the tribe is working, that's Nick Nelson with Interfluve, if anyone knows him. He's a great guy. We're working on a wetlands project that came through EPA. We are identifying all the wetlands that are in Mashpee in our homelands. We are inventorying those wetlands, checking on their conditions, assessing what they need for work, which will lead to a wetlands assessment plan, which will kind of dictate the way we manage our wetlands for the next 6 years. This is stuff that we could not do on our own. And so it's really important to us to be able to do that. And we're extremely appreciative of that assistance. And then these are 3 current projects that are going on right now. There's a lot of this NOAA transformational habitat money that's floating around right now. And through that money, it's being, down in my neck of the woods anyway, it's being funneled through the Association to Preserve Cape Cod, among other folks, and the tribe and Webner, Waquoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve are sub-awardees. And these 3 particular projects are right in our backyard. We've got Red Brook, Upper Quashnet, and Mashpee River. Again, the cultural significance of these locations, I can't speak to it enough. And I know it's really, really hard to see, but there are a lot of project partners on there. These are projects that we're really, really excited to get going. And again, it's habitat restoration, it's fish passage. There's all sorts of things that make up these projects. And what's really super cool about these projects, and what doesn't always happen, is that APCC came to the tribe from the very beginning and asked us, what these projects should look like, what was important to us. If there were to be work done in these areas, what should some of that work look like? So they took our concerns and our ideas into consideration, which, trust me, does not happen very often. Usually when we're brought into a project, we're brought in halfway or even 80% of the way through, and there's not much that we can do. So that was huge for us. And they've been, matter of fact, we've been having, I don't know if there's anyone in here, but we've been having so many planning calls, it's almost like the point where enough with the planning calls, we get it, thank you. But it is important, it really is important, and we're really, really trying to get our tribal members to the table. They want to hear those voices. And this is a brochure or a flyer that's actually going to go out in relation to all these projects. And you can see it's asking tribal members right on there, we want to hear from you. We want to hear what your thoughts are. And, you know, really quickly, I'll just mention why traditional ecological knowledge is so important. If you really think about it, right, traditional knowledge, it's like these systems that have just been passed down from generation to generation, thousands and thousands of years. And I say systems because it's made up of all these different parts that are related to, you know, the environment and natural resources. It's related to our governance and our spirituality. There's just so many things that are involved with it. And if you wanted to know how an ecosystem works and how it has worked and what hasn't worked, if you wanted to know any of that information, wouldn't you ask the people who have lived there and really have not left for 10,000 years? I would think that you would. And that's why it's so important. It really is important. I see examples of it all the time. We were in a meeting recently, about a couple weeks ago. It was in relation to the Mashpee River portion of this, and one of our herring runs is going to be redesigned, and the culvert is going to be redesigned. And we were approached with two options. One was to replace the dam, one was to keep it and just make some adjustments. And so I brought those plans to a Natural Resources Commission meeting a few nights later, and, you know, kind of explained some of the ideas. And yeah, I like this idea. And I was just in there with some elders and some old timers. You know, these guys aren't scientists. They're you know, some of them haven't even graduated college or gone to college. They're, you know, my father's friends and my father's age. And we had a conversation for about an hour and a half, and the information that they provided and the way the herring have moved through that river through the years and the way they pool in this one particular area and they only use this area at night. And I'm thinking, this is the kind of stuff that an engineer would never, ever know. They gave us two plans, right? We can't design a herring run. We might be able to give you a few ideas on what might work or what we'd like to see, you know, maybe better access points or better places to harvest herring. But other than that, this information that was at this meeting is just unbelievable. And if you don't have that, you don't have a real picture of what needs to be done. And we'll be doing this in 30 years. We'll be redesigning another herring run because all the herring runs in our town are obsolete and don't work. They really don't. And this isn't the only river that we're having a problem in. So I know there's folks here from, you know, conservation agencies and that sort of thing. And I don't know if anyone of us have worked together. I don't see a lot of faces right now, but I apologize if you are. And I would just like to throw that out there, that it is very, very important, that partnership. And we do, I promise you, we do receive a lot of assistance, and it's great assistance, and it's well-meaning assistance, and I really do appreciate that. But I wanted to throw that out there as well, just how important that information is. Because, you know, again, it's information that's been passed down typically orally too, over thousands of years, so it's not that you can just thumb through a, whatever it is nowadays, I don't know, what encyclopedia. I'm dating myself. Look under W for WOMP. You know, it's been passed down usually through story and ritual, and so you know, you don't have access to it. You've got to get into the community, and we're more than happy to provide that for you. So these are some super cool projects. Haven't even gotten started yet. Really can't wait to see how these go. And then, you know, a lot of what we do is, you know, we talk about doing things for the next 7 generations. You know, it's why we are trying to protect our lands, our marshlands, our water. We want to make sure that we're doing right by the next 7 generations so that my kids and their kids will have clean water. They'll have land to hunt and gather and fish. So it's extremely important for us. And at the same time, we want to teach these kids not only about their culture and their environment, but, you know, what they can do. Because I'm hoping that some of these kids will be our next scientists and maybe working back again for the tribe, or maybe even with you folks. And so again, these are just a couple of the activities that we had just at last year's POH camp. Up on the upper left, these kids are doing a sea level rise activity, followed by a sea level rise mapping activity. That's one of our tribal members there, Dr. Casey Thornbrew. And then on the bottom right-hand side, they're doing some core sampling in one of our marshes, and that's actually Brian Yellen right here from UMass Amherst. which I actually graduated from too. Thank you very much. Always happy to be home. So, you know, we've got some really smart kids in our community, and we've got some people who are, you know, myself, and not only myself, but people that I work with who really are focused on making sure that these kids have safe environments, clean environments. It's so important because it really does trouble me what I see. I know from the time I was a little kid growing up down in the Cape in the 1970s to right now, what all the changes that I've seen have just been unbelievable. The woods that aren't there anymore, you know, the polluted waterways, the areas where you just won't fish anymore, the fish that aren't here anymore, the animals that aren't here anymore. And it's really, really sad, and it's really, really scary. And I don't know in 55 years what will be left for our children. So, you know, the work that you're doing, the work that we're trying to do it's so important. And I thank you all for your assistance. And I want to just point out that I think we are heading in the right direction. We've got some great examples of things that are going on in our community right now. In that middle picture is some of our native environmental ambassadors. Those are all Mashpee Wampanoag. Most of them are in their teens. Talia Landry's in the middle. She is their mentor, I guess, if you will. And they have a Rights of Herring movement on right now. It's received resolution through council and an ordinance. And what the Rights of Herring movement essentially is, you know, if you're native, you know, we look at, you know, everything, our animal relatives, our fish relatives, the trees, we look at them as relations, and always have. And what I like to tell people is if you had an aunt or an uncle or your grandmother was sick, you do just about anything that you could to make sure that they were better. Anything that you could possibly do to make sure that they had a better future and would be healthy and devoid of that sickness. And that's the way we look at the herring. And so we have made a resolution to give them rights as humans, and they need to be protected as humans. So these young kids here, they've been to, that's New York Climate Week. They've been on cultural exchanges to Alaska. Oh, that's my 20 minutes. And on the right-hand side, they were at a Watertown Dam Herring Festival, speaking to their movement. So these are some wonderful kids. We must be doing something right. So we've got a bright future, and you know, we're hard at work. We have challenges, just like everyone else in this room. But you know, we're doing the work. We're all doing the work. I appreciate everyone's help, and I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you very much.
All right, so that was great. You know, I've known Jason for over 2 years, and I learned so many new things today. I'm just really happy that I'm in the room. We can take any questions you guys have. Just try to speak loudly, I guess. If anyone has trouble hearing, we can repeat the questions to the mic.
So I have a question about bees, honeybees versus native bees. In the community where I live in Western Mass, there seems to be a lot of beekeepers that want to bring in their hives in order to get their business. You know, they want the honey and then they sell the honey. Is that forcing out the native bees? Do the honeybees have sort of a priority in the landscape in their eyes?
Yeah, so the question was, when beekeepers ask to put their hives on a property, how does that impact the native bees? And the question is, it impacts them negatively. The research tells us that one hive, just a single hive in 3 months, collects the amount of pollen equivalent to feeding 100,000 native bees. So what I tell people, it's very simple. If it's a farm, great. If it's a community garden, maybe. If it's a conservation property, just ban beehives, because honeybees are generalists. They don't need special wildflower communities to pollinate. They can really gather their resources from any flower virtually, including invasive species. So if you keep the honeybees at a limited number on developed landscapes like farms, you'll be giving space to the wild insects that we need for our native plant reproduction. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, where do you source your native plants and seeds from?
Yeah, so the question was about sourcing plants and seeds. I can name a few nurseries like in this state, but for each of our projects, we have different lists because, you know, if it's in New York, it's going to be a different list. Here in Massachusetts, I really like to work with Wing and a Prayer Nursery. They're in Cummington. New England Wetland Plants is also really great in South Amherst. We've got in eastern Massachusetts, blue stem natives, dragonfly natives, which is wholesale only, but if you're a large group, you could get signed up. There's Native Plant Trust in Framingham and in Whately, and there's obviously a lot of other, I'll call out a few smaller nurseries. Butterfly Effect in Westport, Prickly Ed's Cactus Patch somewhere on the Rhode Island side, Northeast Native Pollinator Plants up in Vermont. Then you've got larger nurseries, like some of the larger nurseries have a lot of native plants. Van Berkom in New Hampshire, Bigelow, Sylvan, and Weston in Massachusetts is sort of like a mix of native and non-native, so you have to kind of be selective. Any questions for Jason, perhaps?
I have a question about sort of how the plant list intrigues me of like your, because we base a lot of our ranges of native plants in New England off of herbarium records collected by, you know, people who have been collecting plants late 1800s to now. So how in-depth is that list that was compiled from?
I mean, I'm currently learning a lot about this. The list, I sat down with our tribal chief, who is a lifelong gatherer, and went over a lot of those plants with him. And they run the gamut from wetlands, uplands, berries, bushes. And so I took the list from him, honestly, right from Mashpee, right from his mouth. And he gave me a history lesson on why each thing was used and what it was used for and where you can find it and where it should go in this project.
Is that published though?
No. I know a lot of folks are really hesitant to publish that type of stuff, and even on some of these projects where we have worked with the organizations to reintroduce these plants, we're real hesitant about promoting that, just for fear that people might go, oh wow, there's bulrush on this property, and go and try and pick it. So, I mean, maybe that'll change somewhere down the road. I don't think it will now. I don't have a problem sharing the list, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, just like a, you know, species list of like historically used plants.
Yeah. There's nothing, again, that's written anywhere, but I mean, I have a list of that I received from them. If you're interested, I can send it to you.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's also a really good book. It's like sort of part out of print and part PDF. Some of it's PDF only, and some of it you can get it in print. It's by the former botanist, head botanist of the Native Plant Trust, whose name is Arthur Haynes. He has a book called Native Ancestral Plants, and he essentially went throughout all of New England and researched different historical use. In most cases it's indigenous, in some cases it might be early colonial and indigenous, and he writes that out. And it's very surprising. There's actually a lot more use than we're aware of. Perhaps it's not surprising. As far as the pollinators go, that's an arduous process that we undertake with each of our projects. So our first step is essentially, okay, let's say we're working in Mashpee. So we're going to basically do a literature review and figure out which papers have identified certain pollinator species that are data-based declining in that area. We are thankful that we have a lot of good data on the coast, especially for moths and Lepidoptera in general, and specialist bees. We will also look at state lists of like listed species of pollinators. And then we will look at maybe other regional papers and then see which of those species have records in that place. So after we get that, then we have to figure out which plants support those pollinators. To do that is another step where we are searching and combing through records, many of which are digitized, museum collections, papers, other collections, and we're seeing which plants have associations with those pollinators. In some cases, they will say pollen plant, or they'll just say foraging on. And that, we don't know. It could be pollen, it could be nectar. With host plants, there's other data sources. You have the host plant database, which is published out of the UK. That's international. You can look up virtually any Lepidoptera, and it will tell you all the different times it's been cited on a certain host plant, in papers or in reviews. So we build the list backwards from the pollinators that we see are declining in that area, and then we create the plant list. And we are specifying host plants and pollen plants first, followed by nectar plants second. Then we are going to reduce that list to a more manageable number of plants. In the case of Jason's project with the Mashpee, we had to eliminate obligate wetland plants because the site is pretty dry. We included some, like sort of marginal, but essentially they're dry basins for most of the year. In other projects, we might only be focusing on riverine plants. So, each project's different.
Hi, I have a question for Jason. Also, I'm curious, I've noticed that there seems to be a lot more momentum behind tribal partnerships with restoration and land trust lately, and you're hearing a lot more about it, and I'm wondering if you've noticed not just the ecological benefits of that, but internally within the tribe, like politically or socially, or in terms of people's interest in cultural knowledge. Have you seen a change in the tribe that's a result of these projects?
Most of this has been happening very recently. Like I said, these projects haven't even started yet. We're just in the planning stages. What I'm hopeful to see is that when we get these folks in the room, it will elicit that excitement in that participation level, because our people in Mashpee, they're funny a lot, right? They're very protective, and they're untrusting. They really are. And a lot of the folks that I do have to go to that have the knowledge are the elders, and they always come in sort of on guard all the time, right? I am hoping that through this and through better relationships with all these agencies at federal, state, local level, that we can sort of build that trust and have these folks open up a little bit. Because what I do notice right now is that they'll be in a meeting, they won't say much, and then when everyone leaves, then they're throwing out all these ideas, or they're mad at me that I brought someone to why'd you even bring someone here, and all this stuff. So it's very difficult, but I do envision that will be the case, and it's not only the case. There are some folks in Mashpee who have really jumped on this and who are so reliable to me that I go to for everything, like my chief and my Sagamore and that sort of thing. But it's just starting to happen now, and it takes a while. Even from the very beginning, the time you've actually identified a grant opportunity, to writing it, to submitting it, and then waiting, and then planning it. Sometimes you're 18 months to 2 years out. So I'm hopeful.
In the back, yeah.
Your pollinator gardens in the basins are very exciting, and I was wondering, and not to put you on the spot, during your April on the Earth Fair, will there be an opportunity to take up pictures?
So you'll be at the On of the Earth Fair?
That is the plan.
All right, nice, awesome. I'm going to defer to Evan, because I don't know if anything will be. I can certainly show you.
If I'm,
we'll walk it, but I don't.
So the question is will anything be going on in April to look at? I would say minimal. You'll probably see the cover crop for the areas that were direct seeded. You might see, we've had sort of like a warm beginning to the spring. The willows are starting to bloom here in Franklin, or where I am in Franklin County, just like right around now. So I would say maybe some willows. We planted a bunch of willows. A lot of willows. You might see some other trees and shrubs, early blooming. I don't remember everything off the top of my head. But there are willows on site, and you'll certainly see the cover crop and maybe some sedges.
It's just an educational opportunity.
Yeah, so we can walk the site. We'll walk the site, and then I can show you the plans and that sort of thing. We can definitely walk the site and spend some time out there.
Sorry, can you just explain the process with the cover crop? So
Okay. Yeah. So from trial and error, I think we all have those experiences where things just were completely a failure. When you're doing a meadow, you really want to use what's called a nurse crop or a cover crop, because whether it's native flowers or native grasses, they really don't start to germinate until about June of the first year. So we're putting down our seeds usually in the fall. A lot of seeds need what's called stratification to germinate, anywhere from 10 to 90 days at the most of cold weather and then freezing and thawing to kind of break open and start to release the seedlings. But a lot of that activity really doesn't start until like late spring, early summer. So the cover crop starts to grow in pretty much like even right around now as a way to keep the weeds out. And it's called a nurse crop because it kind of nurses the seedlings along. So you want to mow the site the first year after seeding. Every time it gets to be about 12 inches, you want to take it down to about 5 or 6. So you're always keeping it between, let's say, 5 inches at the minimum and 12 at the max. You don't want to go too low because what happens is that the nurse crop is shading the seedlings during the early months of the summer and keeping that early morning, that dew in the morning. We get a lot of rainfall at night in the summer, keeping the seedlings a little bit more moist, a little bit more protected from the harsh sun. And then by the end of the summer, they sort of get above the cover crop. And so then the second growing season, I call it like releasing them from the mowing regime, where maybe you just do like a spring mow, one more mow, like down to 6, let's say like in May of the second year, and then you can just kind of let it grow in. At that point, you're going to be looking at management on a much more specific scale. Maybe you're hand pulling, let's say Queen Anne's lace, or maybe you're cutting back things like annual weeds before they go to seed. Maybe you're occasionally burning it. That's ideal. But kind of changing things up every couple of years. You never want to cut everything down at the same time. Once you get past the second season, theoretically, you could do a third every year. And so the idea is the nurse crop is sort of like a weed pressure strategy.
And that's an annual, right?
Yes. So when we seed in the fall, we'll use winter wheat, what's also known as like hard red wheat, because that will grow early spring. Like it starts to grow in March. If it's a spring installation, like if we're seeding the meadow, let's say in March or April or May, which I don't usually do, we'll use oats, Avena sativa, which are like annual oats. And that does the same thing, but it grows in the summer.
Thank you.
All right, anyone else?
For the grass paths that you put along the library, are those reseeded with like bluegrass, or do you use a native sedge or something?
Yeah, so regarding the paths at the library project, we used fescues, which are technically not native, but they max out at about 8 inches, and the idea was that you wouldn't have to mow them. But unfortunately, the town has been mowing it because they just send the guys out, so it's sort of like being treated like a lawn. But the idea was that it would be a no-mow fescue mix. Like all fescues, no bluegrass, no orchard grass, so that like everything would sort of top out and just flop over.
Was the rotational grazing that took place after the prescribed burn, was that primarily a component of the restoration, or was that sort of incidental way to incorporate something external into it?
No, it was a part of the management. The livestock was on site because I wanted to test whether you could raise sheep for meat and wool and have native plants that are supporting pollinators. So that's why we were observing whether the plants were still blooming within the season and producing seeds. And it's all about the density of the what's called the stocking rate, like how many plants per acre, the quality of the vegetation, like how hard they have to forage to find what they want, and then moving them at the right speed. And what we landed on was moving them basically every 2 days to about a different quarter acre, and then at the end of the week to a brand new section, and then repeating that every 6 weeks. And that 6-week cycle was enough that when they came back, the plants were mature enough that they didn't completely, turn them back into nothing. And so like the plants were able to produce flowers and seeds, even willows. Because the llama basically is more of a browser, so they go for the woodies, and the sheep are more going for the herbaceous. So it depends on the animal. I think the field looked better then than it does now. We've had them off-site for 2 years, and I think it looks less diverse, to be honest. I think the burning plays a large role. And if you're interested in that, there's a book by someone named Chris Helzer. He works for the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska. He manages like a couple thousand acres of tall grass prairie. And he uses bison and prescribed burning like regularly every year, and he does what's called patch burn grazing, where you basically burn and then you release the animals right after the burn, like even within a day. And they prefer to graze in the burned areas because of the flush of new growth, and that actually encourages more plant diversity because of the disturbance. So areas that are burned tend to respond better as far as like native warm season grasses and flowers. A lot of plants get outcompeted over time by European grasses, clover, and invasives if you don't have that regular disturbance. And I think that's one of the main components that's lacking in the Northeast is that, number one, we don't really have a lot of people burning. If they're burning, it's mostly on state lands and they're not allowed to burn on private. Like Mass Wildlife does a good job, but it's only on their own property. For hire burn people, the nearest people I know are in New Jersey, and they charge between $15,000 and $25,000 a day. So you have to get a grant to fund them, which is like nowadays, basically there's no grants. And we don't really have people that we can just call on. And then like not a lot of people even think that livestock want to graze on native systems. They only put the livestock on the clover and the fescue. So it's sort of like no one's willing to test it. But we got a grant from the EEA, which is the Energy and Environmental Administration of MassGov, and it's called Healthy Soil Through Maximum Biodiversity. It's part of the Healthy Soils Action Plan. And one of our tests, so we're working all with farmers to test different approaches to using native plant communities on working farms. And one of our partner farms is in Chesterfield, and they have Scottish Highlander cattle. So those are browsers and grazers, and they're very, very hardy animals that will go onto almost any landscape and find something to eat. And we are creating a seed mix for them that is 100% native, but palatable to livestock. And that will be published sometime in the next year. And there's going to be a workshop this fall. So go to our website, sign up for our newsletter, and I'll keep you up to date on that.
Question about deer browsing, and is there native plants that they seem to prefer those as opposed to the invasives? Is there any particular plants that you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anything's. I mean, there are a few things that are like 100% deer proof, but very few. I think it's really about the conditions of the site and the region. So, you know, you go to, let's say, to give an extreme example, Martha's Vineyard. I mean, almost any plant is going to get browsed by deer, if not devastated completely, without protection. Like you have to have fencing, caging, or almost like daily sprays. You go out to Western Mass, you know, maybe you're only going to have deer in late fall or early spring or they're starving in the winter. But in the winter, the herbaceous plants are dormant, so who cares if they get browsed, right? So it's sort of like, it depends where you are. So like on a Western Mass site, like a large meadow, I'm not going to protect plants, herbaceous plants from deer. I do notice that they do eat the butterfly weed. Like you'll go out one day, the next day it's gone, that sort of a thing. So it's unfortunate, but then that blooms again. Like it will bloom twice in one season if it's browsed, like early enough in the summer. Whereas like, you know, something like a willow, I would absolutely cage that until it gets to be above 6 feet high. So what my approach is basically, if it's like a more rural location with like more balanced pressure where yes, there's a lot of deer, but people still hunt, and there's sort of like an active hunting culture, and there's a lot of other places for them to go, I might only cage the woody plants, and that's mostly looking at fall and winter browse protection, whereas in like a high browse area like the suburbs outside of Boston or certainly the outer islands in Cape Cod, we might want to really consider a more nuanced approach. With Mashpee, we only cage the woodies, and I begged these guys to hunt. I don't know if you guys did any hunting this year on the basin, but it is an issue. It's a major issue. But in the winter, the herbaceous plants are dormant, so if they get browse, I don't think it's that big of a deal.
I wanted to ask about youth involvement. Jason mentioned nature ambassadors and bees and butterflies are kind of like, they excite the imagination of the young. So I was just curious what opportunities there are or what might be done with youth engagement. To make it easier for the
She's asking about youth engagement.
For me?
You've done more of that than I have.
Was that for Al? What's your name again?
You're asking about youth engagement
Yes,
for Jason?
for Jason and if there's
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. So, I mean, we're trying. Let's put it that way. The camp is very, very short period of time. It's only 5 months out of the year. We've talked about doing as many as we can over some of the school breaks. Our education department does do a pretty good job with the younger kids. Most of my work is with middle school age kids and maybe a little bit older. We're just right now establishing, it's called a cultural connectedness youth hunting and fishing program where we're trying to get more kids into the woods and onto the water. Fully grant funded. We have all the supplies that we need. We have all the mentors that we need. We literally just rolled it out. As everyone probably knows, if you're on your phone all day and you're not in the woods, there's higher rates of depression and cultural identity loss. So we're very cognizant of that. So we are trying to do stuff along that lines. It's difficult. It's because we are competing with phones. We're competing with extracurricular activities. It's not like these kids aren't doing anything. They're in sports. They go from one season to another. It's very, very difficult. It's not like when I was a kid, you wanted to be outside all day. But we are very concerned. We're very focused on it, and hopefully we'll be able to make some inroads soon.
Yeah, I'm not targeting youth specifically, but we have worked with them. My target, like this year, is like pretty much everyone. It's just getting people out on the sites because we have a lot of workshops that we're doing with the farmers on our Healthy Soils project. And I think one of the main challenges, honestly, is just, it sort of becomes like a budgetary concern because so I have, people that work with me and a lot of them tend to be younger, like in their 20s, like young designers and landscape architects. And I'm expecting them to do our social media. I'm 46, I don't really use social media that much. I kind of hate it. And they don't really use it. So the people that I work with don't really like Instagram, for example. And I'm like, oh, come on, can't you do a video, do some TikTok or something? And it's just they have to understand the project. They have to understand what species they're talking about. It's very specific. I basically would have to hire a full-time communications manager if I wanted to get people, let's say under the age of 25, onto our projects, onto our workshops. We would have to have this whole different approach that I just don't have the funding to do. So we do what we can. We do flyers, we do digital outreach, we partner with organizations like UMass to get into their newsletter. Sometimes people show up, sometimes we always have someone. But a lot of the people that tend to come are let's call them adults. And that's great, but some of them, it's really unfortunate because, I see a lot of young people, people get excited, especially if they're studying, environmental science or design. They get excited, some of them follow us, but I don't see a lot of young people coming to our volunteer events. When I say young, let's say I'm saying under the age of 30, I don't see a lot of young people doing that. And I think with younger kids, it's even harder because of the reasons that Jason mentioned. But certain organizations, they have their built-in audience. NOFA works with these groups in Springfield and Holyoke to do urban farming. So we're gonna be working with them. And I think it's just a matter of the local partnerships. Not having the consultant do all the outreach is always good. Connecting with local schools. So we're gonna try different approaches this year with printed flyers, social media, newsletters, things like that, and see what sticks.
I'm from New Hampshire, so for Massachusetts, but there's nature groupie, because
sort of like the pop-up phone tree, a little bit more like, also it used to be in sort of like 47 in the oak, or something, a lot of times. But they're pretty great. They sort of just send out like a weekly thing, or like, hey, this weekend, but like, hey, this weekend I have a few hours. Sort of like that.
So it's called Nature Groupie? And it's like a...
It started at UNH, but
Okay.
they have
I'll check that out.
Sign up for it. It's really easy.
Yeah.
I've submitted things to them before. It's super easy. They're really great. I don't know if there's like a direct Massachusetts one, but I'm sure that they cover. I think I did.
You know, it's hard. I don't even want to attribute it to the current political climate, because even going back a few years, like I'll post to like something like the Western Mass Permaculture List, which I've been a member of for a number of years, and like one or zero people will come, and then I'll get like someone that saw it on Instagram that I've never met, and it's just like, you know, I don't know. People are just sort of. People are very siloed, is what I would say. Extremely siloed.
But yeah, I found it.
But in Cape Cod, we got a lot of volunteers. There actually are quite a lot of active groups in Cape Cod. You know, like Edible Landscapes, which is the landscaper we worked with, they brought out a lot of people. People came from Farming Falmouth, and the Quakers came out, who were great. And we had a few people that you knew, so I thought that was pretty successful. In Wellesley, it was great. They had these different groups of like, I don't want to be stereotypical, but it was like literally all women that volunteer. Like there are women that volunteer, and they like picked our site to come out and weed. And we had, you know, master gardeners and stuff come out and help. So it's been pretty decent. Well, thank you all for coming. We'll be around if you want to chat.